Good evening. I'm Jim Zirin, and you are watching The Digital Age. Tonight's show is about our relationship with Russia. During the presidential campaign, Mitt Romney called Russia our #1 geopolitical foe. Around 3 months ago, most experts dismissed Russia as a third-rate power. One even called Russia a Burundi with missiles. Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, was viewed as a clown who rode horses shirtless and wrestled with alligators. Suddenly, Russia's become a major player on the world stage, negotiating a chemicals deal with the United States over the situation in Syria. Tonight's guest is a Russian expert. He is Tom Graham. He is managing director of Kissinger Associates. He's a former member of the National Security Council staff, and he has recently returned from Moscow. No one is in a better position to help us on this question. Can we trust the Russians? Tom, you're welcome.
Glad to be here, Jim.
Now, were you surprised about the Syrian deal and how fast it unfolded?
I think everybody was surprised. It looked like we were moving towards some sort of a political conflict in the United States over the president's decision to launch a military strike. No one expected this to come out of the Russians at this time, but you have to admit it was a brilliant maneuver.
Do you think that it had been in the offing for some time and that perhaps Obama had said he was going to Congress merely to play for time so that he could cut the deal with the Russians? Or do you think it just was a fluke and sort of came out of nowhere?
Well, it wasn't a fluke. I mean, in the sense that the United States and Russia have talked about serious chemical weapons for some time, ever since the unrest began. And obviously, we both have an interest in ensuring that those weapons remain under control, do not fall in the hands of terrorists, and so forth. But we've never been able to come to any agreement on how to actually deal with that, in part, I think, because of differences over how we saw the Syrian crisis, how we thought it should be resolved. Clearly, there were also some discussions in the past couple of weeks on the margins at the G20 summit in St. Petersburg about this issue. But I still think at the end of the day, the president was surprised, as was the political establishment, of the timing of that announcement.
Now, Churchill said many things about Russia, but one of the things he said is the key to understanding Russia is figuring out what is in Russia's national interest. And what was Russia's national interest in cutting a deal with us over chemical weapons in Syria?
Well, actually, there are quite a few. I mean, let's start with the very broad picture. One, Russia's back at the center of the world stage. It's a great power. People are talking positively about Putin for the first time in several months, if not years, in the United States.
Some say he should get the Nobel Peace Prize.
I think the Nobel Peace Prize should go to the person who actually brings peace to Syria. We're a long ways away from that. It's not a prize that you ought to give for simply a statement or the beginnings of a process. And I imagine the committee has learned a few things from the decision to award President Obama the Peace Prize several years ago. But that is something clearly that the Russians will push because it puts their president and their country in a positive light, something that they are very eager to do. But the second thing that Putin did is that he's postponed, and perhaps indefinitely, the American use of military power in Syria. Now, we could have an argument in this country of whether it was appropriate or not, or what the results might have been. But you have to admit that the United States still is the preeminent military power, and our military puts on a tremendous display of conventional force. Putin clearly didn't want that. It makes his own generals feel much better because they know how far Russia lags behind the United States in the ability to apply conventional force. So that's a second. Within Syria itself, he's advanced two of his top priorities. One, he's turned Assad into a partner in eliminating chemical weapons. So all the talk about U.S.-led regime change, ousting Assad, has to be put on the back burner for at least the next several months. Second, he has prevented a type of operation in Syria that he believes would have played into the hands of the radical Islamists. And so he's pushed that off for some time. So I think when Putin looks at the score sheet at this point, he comes and says, the check marks are pretty much in the positive side for me so far.
Why is he worried about the radical Islamists? I think in his New York Times op-ed, which we'll probably come back to, he had said he was worried that they would be trained in Syria, then come over to Russia.
Well, this has been a focus for Putin since he rose to power in Russia. Remember that he emerged as the successor to Yeltsin at the time of the Chechen campaign. And although we have radically different assessments of what was happening on the ground in Chechnya, Putin clearly saw this as radical Islam seeking to undermine and erode Russia, the Russian state. And he fought a very bitter and bloody campaign there to win over or win against the radicals. I think he's also concerned about the spread of radical Islam into Central Asia, and from there into more strategic parts of Russia itself. So this has been a major concern for Putin for the past 12 years. Anything that leads to instability in a Muslim area, anything that might foster the rise of radical Islam, they see as a threat to them.
Well, we share that, actually, don't we?
We do and we don't, because what the Russians are concerned about is radical Islam penetrating into the Muslim populations of Russia itself and fueling not only instability but separatist movements, which they see as a threat to the territorial integrity of the Russian state itself. What we're concerned about is the 9/11, the Al-Qaeda type of terrorist that devastates us, but we're not really worried about radical Islam undermining the foundations of the United States as a society. We're not worried about the territorial integrity of the United States.
The Russians really had a further interest in Syria, didn't they? They have a naval base in Tartus, which they've had for some time on the Mediterranean.
Yeah, I think that's really more symbolic than anything else. It's really a repair facility. It can accommodate only a few ships at a time. My guess is for the Russians, it was really much more valuable as a listening post, an intelligence platform in the Middle East than anything else. Clearly, they still have an interest in retaining it. And in any sort of post-Syrian crisis, they would like to be there and perhaps expand. But I wouldn't put too much emphasis on that as a reason why the Russians are engaged in Syria the way they are at the moment.
Do they really care about chemical weapons in Syria?
They do care about chemical weapons. I think they care about the use of chemical weapons as well. As I said, they don't want these to fall in the hands of terrorists. They don't want these to find their way into the North Caucasus, where they could be used inside Russia against Russians. And so for the past several years, they have been, in fact, opponents of the proliferation of not only chemical weapons, but all weapons of mass destruction. Now, where we get into difficulties with the Russians is when this becomes a concrete issue in a specific country, Iran or Syria, where I think the common desire to prevent the proliferation of these weapons runs into different geopolitical interests. How we think about Iran, how we think about Syria, how we think about our relations with those two countries, and the broader situation in the Middle East.
Now, Putin said that he stood for principles of non-intervention and international law. So if that's true, he achieved his purpose really by deterring the United States from a preventive strike.
No, absolutely. And one of his other interests is to keep these types of issues within the UN Security Council, where Russia has a veto. This gives them a voice on what is done. So Putin has been clear over the past several years that the only thing or the only institution that can legitimize the application of force is, in fact, the UN Security Council. And he's going to continue to do that. He won't fall off that unless there's a case where Russia needs to defend its national interest through the use of force.
Then they'll be all for it.
And if they can't get a UN Security Council resolution, they will do what they have to do to defend their own interests.
Now, the United States agreement with Russia over Syria, as I understand it, says nothing about the use of force. And now let's assume that the deal doesn't hold and the Syrians drag their feet or conceal chemical weapons from the inspectors. then what happens?
Well, first of all, I mean, that is a sticking point in the discussion of the resolution at the UN Security Council, because the United States, Great Britain, and France clearly want some language that indicates that the use of force is an option should Saddam balk at complying with this framework agreement. If he does, and it isn't included in the UN Security Council, then in a sense we're back to where we were a couple of weeks ago. The United States, and I think the President has made this clear, still reserves the unilateral right to use force if they believe they need to in order to, however you want to phrase it, punish Assad or to make sure that the Syrian regime doesn't use chemical weapons again. But we'll be back to the debate that we were in the midst of just a couple of weeks ago in the United States.
But before the deal, it seemed clear that Congress was not going to approve any involvement of the United States in Syria, at least any military involvement, such as was proposed by the President. So then, and 80% or more of the American people are opposed to any involvement.
I agree. I think the administration, if it has to move towards this option again, I think is hoping that one, that it went through a diplomatic process, and the diplomatic process failed to achieve the goals will improve their position. That said, the President is going to have to make a much more persuasive argument to the American public about what he's trying to achieve in Syria, why the application of military force is going to achieve that result. That's something that he failed to do over the past couple of weeks. One of the reasons he was facing potentially humiliating defeat in the Congress. So the administration is going to have to do a lot more work on thinking through its strategy, the arguments it's going to use, if it comes to the conclusion that the use of force is a necessity in order to advance American interest.
Well, the President never defined or elaborated the kind of military strike he was contemplating, and so we were really in the dark as to what it was going to be. Was it going to be a pinprick? Was it going to be symbolic? Were they going to take out some airports? Were they going to try to get at the chemical weapons facilities? We don't really know. So, I mean, what do you think a military strike against Syria would have looked like?
Well, we don't know at this point. But there's a broader problem here, and that is the President has to define a broader strategy towards the Middle East and towards Syria. You don't simply use military force because you can use military force. You have to use military force for a specific purpose if you're going to succeed. And that should be part of a broader strategy towards the region. That's one of the reasons I believe the President was so unpersuasive in his argumentation. No one understood why we were doing this, what the result was supposed to be, and even if it was to punish Assad, the types of strikes they were talking about, launched at certain regime institutions, certain military facilities, did not appear to be sufficient to actually punish Assad.
So the Assad regime would have survived. The rebels would not have been materially aided, except perhaps there would have been an escalation of violence as a result of the military strike.
That's obviously possible. And there was already, I think, some discussion in the United States that if Assad survived, that would actually further legitimize him in the eyes of those supporters he has in Syria. He took the best blow the United States could deliver, and he's still standing.
Let's go back to Putin's op-ed in the New York Times. Rather well written. It was denounced as a publicity stunt. What did you make of the whole thing?
Well, it was well written, and I would presume that Putin didn't write it himself. He certainly had some help with someone who understood the English language.
Maybe someone in America.
Almost certainly someone in America, and I would presume well paid for the effort. Look, he made the points that he wanted to make, and my guess is that he took a special glee in pointing out what he thought were the weaknesses in the U.S. position, but also I think in pointing out that some of the things that were happening were the result of U.S. actions. International law, the UN Security Council, he made it clear. It's the United States that insisted on the veto when we founded the United Nations.
Well, we didn't foresee everything that was going to happen after 1945.
But again, the arguments about international law, about the downsides of the use of military force in the past, all the problems that we've had in Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think something that he calculated would play to the American audience, which is war-weary. We know that. And Putin played on that. Where I think he misstepped was probably at the end when he talked about American exceptionalism, which I think steps over a boundary for the American public.
But Obama used that phrase in his speech, so he was really saying, you know, you're not so exceptional as you think you are. All men are created equal.
Well, yes, but not all nations are created equal, and that may be the difference. We do have a unique history. We do play I think, a unique role in global affairs. We can argue about it. You know, I think most Americans believe that on the whole it's been positive. In any event, this gets at the core of who we think we are as a people. It's about our national identity, and I think Putin needed to treat that issue with a bit more care than he did. And in many ways, it will detract attention from the rest of the argument, some of which are positive points. And we have to remember to sort of detach this from the messenger and focus on what was said, see whether that was reasonable and whether it calls for any adjustments in the way we approach global affairs.
Well, his purpose in writing the article, it seemed to me, was to kind of raise the consciousness of the American people to the folly of any intervention, military intervention in Syria of the type that was the president had outlined in his speech. And don't you think he achieved his purpose?
I think he played to an audience that was receptive to that message. But, you know, as we've talked, I mean, the problem has been that the president could not convincingly explain why he thought this military option was going to achieve any result that advanced U.S. interest in that part of the world. And Putin leapt on that.
There was a point at which, at least there was talk, that a Russian delegation was going to come and speak to Congress and lobby Congress against intervention. Is this, in your experience, is this the first time the Russians have ever done that?
Well,
if they did it?
I think it's the first time they contemplated something like that. It would have been interesting to see how that would have played itself out. And the problem here in dealing with the Russians is that we do know that chemical weapons were used in Syria. And if you look at the evidence, not only presented by the United States and our allies, but what the UN reported at the beginning of this week, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that it was the regime that used those chemical weapons. The Russians insist that it wasn't the regime, that they've got evidence that it was a provocation by the opposition.
That was in the op-ed piece.
But they have never presented a shred of that evidence for public scrutiny. When I was in Moscow 10 days ago, what I heard from my Russian counterparts was along the following lines. It would have been illogical for Assad to use chemical weapons because the UN inspectors were on the ground, he knew of the threats and so forth. And the response to that is, you know, there's logic and then there's evidence. And what we have to do is focus on the evidence, and then we can ask the questions about the motives behind it. The Russians do not appear inclined to focus on the evidence at this point. I think they want to obfuscate the issue. They want to talk about logic and other things. They want to decry the evidence that has been presented, raise questions, but they're unwilling or unable to present evidence that would support their position as to what had taken place in Syria.
So if I'm arrested for robbing a bank and I have a ski mask in my pocket and a gun, it's no answer for me to say, why would I have wanted to rob a bank?
Well, you know, if you could say, I'm a rich man, why would I want to rob a bank,
That's right?
And it doesn't make any sense, even though you're caught with all the smoking gun and the ski mask.
So there it is. Now, it'd be interesting to try to analyze it. The Russians are foes, as Mitt Romney suggested, or are they our friends? Can we trust them? The Cold War is over, but yet at every opportunity they seem to try to jab us in some way, and their rhetoric has been largely anti-Western.
Well, Russia thinks of itself as a great power, and it continues to measure itself in many ways by its ability to cooperate or compete with the United States. it always wants to have a voice on the world stage. And in many ways, it demonstrates that it has a voice on the world stage by saying something opposite to what the United States might say at any moment. You know, that said, I don't see them as our geopolitical foe number one. They're a big country. They have interest. They have some capacity to advance those interests. The challenge for the United States is to understand what those interests are, how the Russians might go about pursuing that, and then factor that into our own strategy. To do things on our part that create the greatest opportunity that we will advance our interests. Sometimes we can do this with the Russians, and eliminating chemical weapons in Syria may be a case in point. At some times we're going to have to counter the Russians. But I don't think that we should think of the Russians as either friend or foe at this point. They're big power, and we're going to have a varied relationship with them based on the issues, based on what we're trying to do, and how that relates to Russia's own national interests.
So can we trust them?
We can trust them
as long as we can see them?
as long as we can verify, as President Reagan would have said.
That's right. Now, we've struck a deal with them over Syria. Is it a good deal? And also, can they deliver their clients Syria?
Well, you know, we don't know at this point. That's the big question. What we have is a framework agreement. We want to eliminate the chemical weapons. What has to be worked out are all the details of how you actually go about doing that in a war zone. And the discussion at the UN, the discussion in Geneva at the organization that deals with chemical weapons will focus exactly on that. And once we have a detailed plan, then I think we begin to ask the question of whether the Russians can actually deliver Assad. Assad is not a puppet. Assad has his own interests. He will use the Russians to advance those. But if he feels the Russians are asking him to do something that undermines himself or puts his own position as threat, he's going to have tremendous incentive to obstruct, deceive, and so forth. That's when I think the rubber really meets the road, and we find out whether the Russians have the type of leverage that they're suggesting they have. He actually can bring Assad along in a program that will eliminate his chemical weapons.
Well, Assad's interest is really to save his own skin and that of his family. And don't you think he'll keep a secret stash of chemical weapons somewhere just in case the rebels surround Damascus?
I certainly think that he would be thinking about that at this point. And
That's occurred to him.
Right, exactly, for the reasons that you've said. And again, that's what makes this so difficult. You know, he has incentives to look like he's complying, to give up some of this, but there's also an incentive to keep some in reserve for an unforeseen occurrence.
Now, prior to the most recent events, I would have talked to you for the entire program about Snowden, but can you tell us about Snowden? Why did the Russians, whom we're now shaking hands with, refuse to hand over Snowden for extradition?
Well, I think the argument the Russians would give is we don't have an extradition treaty with Russia. But look,
well, but it would have been a nice thing to do.
Yeah,
if
but
they
you know,
were friends.
But the Russians simply don't do nice things to be nice. They do things like this for a reason. I think if you flip this, it's hard to imagine the United States handing over an intelligence officer who had revealed what Snowden has revealed about our capabilities, whether intentionally to the Russians or intentionally to us or simply incidentally. We would have raised the arguments about how we would have been treated in Russia, about the lack of confidence in the Russian judicial system and so forth, and prison system.
They said we torture them and then execute.
Exactly. I mean, we don't think that's the way our country operates.
But they don't think that's the way their country
operates. So, I mean, I understand that. And it would have been very difficult for Putin to explain domestically why he decided to give Snowden back to the United States. I think that was what fundamentally factored into his decision on Snowden. We'll see how this plays itself out. I'm not confident at all that Snowden is going to have a pleasant time in Russia. And after a few winters, he may be thinking that coming back to the United States and facing a trial, a jury here, might be better than 30 or 40 years in Russia.
Might be better here. Quick question for you. Do you think that this new period of cooperation is going to bode well for the situation in Iran? Do you think the Russians will try to help us pressure Iran into giving up their nuclear program?
Well, again, I think we're on different sides of this issue, and at least we interpret the facts on the ground in a different way. We clearly believe that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. The Russians would tell us they're not so sure. That's one. Two, although the Russians don't have an interest in Iran developing a nuclear weapon, that's not really one of their top priorities. They look at Iran in a regional context, and Iran has been willing to cooperate with Russia in Central Asia, for example. They didn't denounce the Russians for what they did in Chechnya several years ago. So the Russians have an interest in working with Iran for that reason. But there's another factor as well. And the Russians have an interest in some tension between Iran and the United States, Iran and Europe, because Iran is sitting on piles of gas.
And it stirs the soup. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up on that note. But Tom Graham, thank you so much for coming by.
You're certainly welcome.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. For the Digital Age, I'm Jim Zirin. Please visit our website at www.digitalage.org. Good night and all the best.